This is Chapter 1 of Paul Bahn's Archaeology, a very short introduction, the origins and development of archaeology. Archaeology, like nostalgia, is not what it used to be. So where did it come from? What is the archaeology of archaeology? Most human beings have some interest in the past. Indeed, together with the fact that we know we are going to die and that we are uniquely capable of destroying our planet, this may be one of humankind's distinguishing characteristics. It seems likely that humans have always been curious about the traces left by their predecessors. We can never know when this began, but there are many cases where ancient cultures seem to have collected or even venerated even more ancient objects. For example, a 5th century Thracian princess in the Balkans had a collection of Stone Age axes in her graves. In North America, Iroquoian sites of 15th and 16th century AD contain artifacts made thousands of years earlier, while in South America, Inca emperors are said to have collected the spectacularly pornographic pottery of the Moche culture, already centuries old. The earliest known archaeologist was Nabonidus, king of Babylon, who in the 6th century BCE excavated a temple floor down to a foundation stone laid thousands of years before. In D.W. Griffith's magnificent silent epic Intolerance of 1916, one scene has the following caption: Belshazzar's father had a red-letter day. He excavates a foundation brick of the temple of Naram Sin, built 3,200 years before. Incidentally, he remarks that Cyrus, the Persian, Babylon's mighty foe, is nearing the city. This suggests that even the earliest pioneers of archaeology were obsessed with their subject and prone to absent-mindedness. Not that archaeologists were always like those of today. In fact, in Greece during the 1st centuries AD, the term denoted a category of actors who recreated ancient legends on stage through dramatic mimes. The term archaeology, as understood today, was reinvented by a 17th century doctor and antiquary of Lyon called Jacques Spon. He also proposed the word archaeography, but that one fell on stony ground. In the Roman period, Julius Caesar's soldiers discovered many tombs of great antiquity when they were found in colonies in Italy and Greece. They rifled them for pots and bronzes, which were sold for high prices in Rome, an early example of grave robbing and trade in antiquities. Even the Emperor Augustus was said by the historian Suetonius to have collected the huge skeletons of extinct sea and land monsters, popularly known as giant's bones, and the weapons of ancient heroes. By medieval time, people in Europe were becoming intrigued by magic crocks, pots, probably cremation urns, which mysteriously emerged from the ground through erosion or the actions of burrowing animals. At the same time, humanly worked flints and polished stone axes were constantly turning up as farmers plowed their fields. According to popular belief, these artifacts were elf-shot or thunderbolts, and in fact they were venerated and collected by people as far afield as Africa and India, often being used as amulets or charms. In Europe, many found their way into the cabinets of curiosities, collections of natural and artificial objects put together by early antiquaries, and the realization slowly dawned in more enlightened minds that these thunderbolts and magic crocks were in fact humanly made relics of ancient peoples. At the same time, discoveries of Greek and Roman sculptures were inspiring contemporary artists to study classical forms, while wealthy families began to collect and display classical antiquities. It was in the 16th century that, in Northwest Europe, some scholars really began to question Francis Bacon's claim that the most ancient times, except where it is preserved of them in scriptures, are buried in silence and oblivion, and recognized that information about the ancient past could be derived from the study of field monuments. A whole series of antiquaries in Britain, Scandinavia, and elsewhere started to visit and describe monuments. The 17th and 18th centuries saw these activities grow into a more systemic interest, accompanied by increasing numbers of excavations. While most digs were intended merely to retrieve objects from the ground, a few pioneers treated the work like a careful dissection, noting the relationship of artifacts to different layers of soil and realizing that, on the whole, objects from upper layers must be younger than those from layers below. This new approach to interrogating and reading the ground and the landscape like a document led to a craze for barrow digging, for example, excavating the burial mounds of Northwest Europe or North America. This was above all a leisure pursuit for gentlemen, clerics, doctors, businessmen, school teachers, and the like. Even today, these professions make a noble contribution to amateur archaeology. It was really only in the early to mid 19th century that archaeology took over from antiquarianism, in the sense of aspiring to be systematic and scientific about the vestiges of the past. This was the period when, through discoveries in Western Europe of stone tools in association with now extinct animals, the great antiquity of humankind was first established and eventually became generally accepted. By the end of the 19th century, true archaeology was already a flourishing enterprise, with many of the greats hard at work, Petrie in Egypt, Cold Away at Babylon, Schliemann in the Aegean, Pitt's Rivers in Britain. For most of those pioneers, with the possible exception of the slippery and mendacious Schliemann, it was no longer a treasure hunt but a search for information and a means of answering specific questions. Through the 20th century, thanks to the efforts of a whole series of major figures such as Wheeler in Britain and India, Reisner and Woolley in the Near East, Ulla and Kidder in America, Bordes and Leroy Goffran in France, it has become a massive, multidisciplinary undertaking, drawing on the expertise of innumerable fields. From geophysicists, who can detect something of what lies beneath the ground with a series of gadgets, and aerial photographers, to zoologists, botanists, chemists, geneticists, and a whole gamut of scientists who can produce dates from archaeological material or from the sediments that enclose it. Today, science-based archaeology is very much to the fore, with genetics also contributing enormously to many aspects of the study of the past. Archaeologists are also taking part in some of the most prominent debates of our age, such as the role of climate change, the effects of rises in sea level, and the possibility of global warming. Studies of the timing of and impact of ancient earthquakes and tsunamis have suddenly become of crucial importance in assessing the likelihood of their future occurrence and the spatial extent of their effects. There have been two major trends in archaeology over time. First, archaeology has become far slower and more painstaking. Instead of setting about the archaeological layers with pickaxes, or even explosives, as in the past, each layer is carefully shoveled, scraped, or brushed away, and everything is sieved so as not to lose any scrap of information the earth might hold. For example, down the Pit of Bones at Atapuerca, Spain, a chamber deep inside the cave that holds the skeletons of scores of people from at least 600,000 years ago. In fact, this appears to be the world's oldest known funerary ritual. The excavators remove only about 10 inches of soil each July. This yields around 300 human bones, which are all they can handle, since each has to be cleaned and hardened and conserved. The work is incredibly meticulous, and the remaining sediments are watched and sieved so carefully that even the tiny bones of the inner ear have been recovered. The second major trend is that, ironically, we are not only acquiring vastly increased quantities of material of all kinds, but thanks to the development of new techniques and scientific analyses, we can now learn far more from each object. Take, for instance, a single potsherd, a fragment of pottery. Fragments of pottery are among the most durable and hence most ubiquitous kind of archaeological evidence. In the past, a sherd would simply have been classed as a type, based on its shape, material, and decoration, if any. Now, however, one can obtain a detailed breakdown of its raw materials, enabling their source to be pinpointed. One can learn at what temperature it was fired, and with what material it was tempered. The pot itself can be dated by the technique of thermoluminescence, and other methods can be used to analyze the faintest traces of residue on its inner surface, and thus tell us what it used to contain. In other words, as archaeology develops, it is doing much more with far less. It is also, alas, producing far too much in every sense. There are ever-growing numbers of archaeologists all over the world competing for positions, and all trying to produce information or new data. Huge numbers of conferences and symposia are being held, most of which eventually have their proceedings published in book form. Consequently, the subject's literature is out of control. A vast, multi-headed hydra with new journals and a series of monographs springing up every year, which few can afford and which even libraries are hard-pressed to buy in these days of shrinking budgets. Nobody can hope to keep up with all the literature on a single period or specialty, let alone on the archaeology of a continent, and still less of the whole world. Things have become even worse in recent years, with an incredible quantity of material being placed on the web. Many libraries are abandoning hard copies of journals in favor of their electronic versions, which certainly take up far less space. And a new phenomenon known as gray literature, in every sense, has sprung up, which comprises endless semi-published or unpublished reports, which can be hard to track down, which may contain useful information. So, in some ways, ironically, the new technology has actually made it harder to keep up with the literature. Things were very different before the war. If you take a look at the original doctoral dissertations of such great names as Graham Clark or Glenn Daniel in Cambridge's University Library, you will find that they are very slim volumes indeed, barely equivalent to a single thesis chapter these days. Of course, there is a lot less archaeology to learn and read in their student days, and they did not have the luxury of the great gods Xerox, Epson, and Apple, and had to rely on taking notes and copying maps by hand. At the same time, museums are full to overflowing, with conservation becoming an increasing problem. In Egypt, for example, archaeologists have even taken to reburying objects in the knowledge that they will survive better and longer for future generations to look at, if entrusted to Mother Earth rather than to museum cellars or warehouses. Just as there is a huge backlog of unpublished excavations, so there is an artifact mountain, a vast collection of uncatalogued and/or unstudied objects in the world museums. Things are so bad that Naples Museum had to shut its doors for a while some years ago because thousands of coins and other objects were disappearing from its storerooms where less than half the stock was catalogued. There's clearly much to do, if archaeology is to put its supremely untidied and overstuffed house in order. Archaeology is a separate subject. Since the renewed optimism in the 1960s, archaeologists have had much greater confidence in their subjects' ability to make a unique contribution to the study of human behavior. And this is especially important in North America in view of archaeology's relationship there with sister disciplines. Anthropology simply means the study of humanity. In Britain, it is divided into social or cultural anthropology, which analyzes human culture and society, and physical or biological anthropology, which studies human physical characteristics and how they have evolved. In America, however, archaeology is also considered to be very much an integral part of anthropology. Most academic archaeologists are found in departments of anthropology, where the subject is treated as a subdiscipline rather than as a field in its own right as it is in the Old World. Archaeology has been called the past tense of cultural anthropology, and since it deals with the human past, it is undeniably an aspect of anthropology. However, it is equally a part of history. In fact, history could be reasonably described as the tip of archaeology's iceberg, since for more than 99% of the human past, archaeology is the only real source of information. History, apart from oral history, only begins with the introduction of written records around 3000 BC in Western Asia and much later in most parts of the world. And even for the historical periods, information derived from archaeological data is still an invaluable complement to what is known from texts, and in any case, it is often the archaeologist who unearths the documents and inscriptions in the first place. One fundamental difference, of course, between anthropology and archaeology is that anthropologists, by and large, have an easy time of it, able to observe behavior and interview informants because anthropology happens in the present. Of course, some pedants in post-processual archaeology, of course, have pointed out there's no such thing as the present, since as soon as you become conscious of the moment, it's already in the past. This kind of facile observation, however, merely invites a loud raspberry. Archaeologists' informants are dead, and its evidence far more mute. Answers need to be coaxed out. It is almost a difference between chatting to a bright, sharp youth on the one hand, and a corpse on the other. Another corollary of this difference is that whereas anthropologists can see how their subjects behave and ask for explanations, archaeologists have to reconstruct behavior. In order to do this, they need to make massive assumption that human behavior has remained unchanged since at least the appearance of anatomically modern humans, perhaps 100,000 years ago, and is therefore predictable. Exactly the same kind of assumptions have to be made about the animals and plants they exploited. For example, that their behavior, tastes, tolerances of climate, environment, or soil and humidity have always been the same and can therefore be reliably predicted when reconstructing the past. These are enormous assumptions to make, especially as we can never be sure that they are justified, but they are crucial because without them, archaeology simply could not function. If we cannot guess with some accuracy how humans in the past would have reacted in a given set of circumstances, we might as well give up the challenge and become anthropologists. It's far less of a headache. End of chapter 1.